we're diving into one of the most brutal and strategically complex 2-year campaigns of World War II.
The fight to push the Axis powers, the Nazis and the fascists out of Italy?
Yeah. And when Allied planners first looked at Italy on a map, they saw a shortcut, a rapid way to knock out an enemy and strike at Germany.
They did. They famously called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe. The strategy looked almost appealingly simple on paper.
Right. Open a second major front in the south.
And by doing that, you force Hitler to pull troops away from that massive fight on the Eastern Front against the Soviets.
And away from France, where everyone knew the Allies were planning a future, much bigger landing.
So the mission was really twofold. First, pull German resources south. And second, secure the entire Mediterranean Sea.
That sea route was absolutely vital. You needed to move supplies, oil, men, everything, really. And General Dwight D. Eisenhower, he led the initial planning for this whole thing.
The mission was, ultimately, to capture the capital, Rome, and then just keep pushing north until they hit the borders of Germany itself. The whole idea was speed. They thought Italy would break really quickly.
And that idea of a quick victory, it starts to get tested almost immediately. We're talking July 1943 with Operation Husky.
The invasion of Sicily. And this was not a small-scale raid.
No, you're talking about over 150,000 troops from the United States, Great Britain, and Canada all hitting the island at once.
The sheer scale was pretty unprecedented for the Allies up to that point. They used combined forces just brilliantly. You had Allied paratroopers dropping in behind German and Italian lines.
To cause immediate chaos.
Exactly. While thousands of soldiers were landing on the beaches from transport ships at the same time.
And you had those two famous rival commanders leading the ground forces, General George S. Patton for the Americans and Bernard Montgomery for the British.
Patton, of course, was all about speed, racing up the western side of the island.
While Montgomery took a more methodical approach up the east. But crucially, the Allies had total air superiority. Their planes were just bombing Italian airfields and supply routes relentlessly.
Which made it nearly impossible for German reinforcements to stabilize their defense.
And that air control meant pretty quick success, right? In about 6 weeks, Allied forces had pushed the last of the German and Italian defenders right across the Strait of Messina.
Sicily was clear, and the Allies were now staring directly at the Italian mainland. But this is where the political fallout of that defeat really kicks in.
Oh, absolutely. That 6-week loss completely shattered the fascist regime from the inside. It triggered a political earthquake.
And that was probably the most immediate strategic success of the whole Sicily operation.
For sure. The top leadership of Mussolini's own party, the Grand Council of Fascism, they turned on him in late July. They held a meeting, blamed Mussolini directly for the whole disaster, and then voted to remove him from power.
It was just a spectacular collapse of a dictatorship.
The King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, he acted on that vote immediately. He called Mussolini in, informed him he was dismissed, and had the police arrest him right on the spot.
And that was the end of the fascist regime that had ruled Italy for 20 years.
The public reaction was, well, it was pure joy. People flooded the streets, tearing down fascist symbols. They really thought that with Mussolini gone, the war for Italy was finally over.
So the new Italian government, they were terrified the Germans would try to rescue Mussolini, so they whisked him away to a secret mountain prison.
Which brings us to the next massive turning point, Italy switching sides.
Right. The new government, led by a man named Marshal Pietro Badoglio, started secret talks with the Allies almost immediately. They wanted out of the Axis alliance.
And they finally pulled the trigger on September 8th, 1943. They announced the armistice, a formal agreement to stop fighting to the whole world.
And this happened at almost the exact same moment that Allied troops were landing on the Italian mainland at Salerno.
But the Germans, they weren't surprised by this betrayal at all. They were ready.
Oh, they were more than ready. Adolf Hitler was furious. And the German military had already been moving forces into position, just in case. They moved incredibly fast.
Disarming huge numbers of Italian soldiers, taking control of northern and central Italy. They seized every key city and defensive position they could.
It was total chaos for the Italian army. It was just dissolved almost overnight.
Soldiers had an impossible choice. Either get taken prisoner by the Germans or just drop your rifle, shed your uniform, and try to walk home.
And Hitler's orders were clear. Hold the Italian peninsula at all costs.
So instantly, the entire nature of the campaign changed. It wasn't a quick invasion against a collapsing enemy anymore.
No, it became a brutal, slow, grinding fight against a dug-in, highly motivated German army that was defending terrain, just perfectly suited for defense.
And this is where we have to talk about that soft underbelly idea. Because when the Allies landed at Salerno in Calabria, they immediately found out just how wrong the planners had been.
The geography of Italy is the whole story here. It's basically a long, mountainous spine running right down the middle of the peninsula.
So you've got these narrow coastal plains, the only flat ground, and then almost immediately incredibly steep rocky hills.
It gives every single advantage to the defender.
Think about it this way. Instead of fighting on open ground like in France where you can use tanks, here the Allies had to fight their way up slopes that were almost vertical walls.
Fighting for every single ridge, every single peak, and the German artillery, sitting way up high, could just rain fire down on the Allied troops on the beaches and plains below.
The pace was just painfully slow, and that slow grind takes us into late 1943 when the conditions get even worse.
Because that's when the Germans established their massive defensive network, the Winter Line. And this isn't just one trench. It's a whole series of fortified positions across the highest mountains.
And the weather was a total nightmare. Torrential rains, snow, freezing temperatures. The dirt roads turned into this thick, impassable mud that just swallowed trucks and artillery.
Soldiers were fighting uphill in the freezing cold, under constant shelling. It was just hellish.
And the most infamous anchor point of this whole winter line was the historic monastery of Monte Cassino. It's this ancient building sitting high on a peak.
Which gave German observers a perfect, unobstructed view of every single Allied move down below.
The fight for Cassino wasn't just a battle, it was a siege that lasted for months. The Allies launched 4 major attacks between January and May of 1944.
And the casualties were just horrific, especially for the multinational forces there. You had Polish troops, Indian troops, French troops, all taking devastating losses.
Now, there's always been this debate. Were the Germans actually inside the monastery?
The general consensus is that the monastery itself was not occupied by soldiers, but the hills all around it were heavily fortified, and the building itself was a magnificent observation post.
So Allied commanders, believing they couldn't break the line otherwise, made the really terrible decision to bomb the historic building.
And even though they destroyed it, the bombing didn't immediately break the German defense. If anything, the rubble created an even better defensive position for the German paratroopers dug in there.
So, faced with this awful stalemate, Allied commanders try a risky shortcut.
Another shortcut. They planned an amphibious landing-at-sea invasion behind the German lines to try and bypass Monte Cassino entirely. The goal was to rush straight for Rome. This was the Anzio plan in January 1944.
And the initial landing, it worked perfectly. It was a complete tactical surprise. The Germans were caught totally off guard.
But then you have this classic military lesson in hesitation. The Allied commanders on the beach were overly cautious. They hesitated to push inland right away.
And that pause cost them everything.
Everything. The Germans, with their incredible tactical speed, rushed reinforcements to the area and surrounded the beachhead within days. Anzio went from a potential breakout to a tiny, cramped, muddy pocket.
Yeah, instead of a quick march to Rome, the Anzio beachhead became a death trap. Soldiers were stuck in trenches for months, under constant fire from German long-range artillery that could hit every single inch of the beach.
They were besieged by the very defenders they were supposed to be outflanking.
That horrible stalemate lasted all the way until May. It took a massive, coordinated offensive, with the troops at Monte Cassino finally breaking through and the Anzio forces pushing out at the same time.
But when the German lines finally broke, the road to Rome was wide open.
And on June 4th, 1944, General Mark Clark led the American Fifth Army into the capital city.
And crucially, Rome was declared an open city.
Meaning the Germans chose not to defend it, which saved all the ancient historical sites from being destroyed in the fighting.
The local population just poured into the streets, celebrating the American and British soldiers as liberators. It was a huge symbolic victory.
The very first Axis capital to be liberated in the entire war. A massive propaganda win.
But history played a bit of a trick here. That moment of victory was extremely brief.
Because just 2 days later, June 6th, 1944,
the D-Day landings in Normandy, France.
And the scale of D-Day instantly overshadowed everything that had happened in Italy. The focus of the world, and more importantly, the bulk of Allied supplies and attention, shifted permanently north to France.
And despite losing Rome, most of the German forces in Italy managed a skillful retreat north. They weren't broken. They just pulled back to establish their final major line of defense.
The Gothic Line.
Another masterpiece of defensive engineering, using the steepest natural peaks and ridges of the northern Apennine Mountains. It was meant to be the final wall protecting Germany itself.
And this is the phase of the war where the Italian resistance fighters, the partisans, become absolutely essential to the Allied effort.
These weren't professional soldiers, but they were incredibly effective. They operated behind German lines, sabotaging supply routes, blowing up bridges.
And feeding the Allies crucial intelligence about German troop movements.
The fighting along the Gothic line was just as grueling, lasting into the very last days of the war. But what happened to Mussolini?
Ah, right. Well, he didn't stay in that mountain prison for long. In a really spectacular and audacious glider raid, German paratroopers rescued him.
And Hitler immediately set him up as the puppet leader of something called the Italian Social Republic in northern Italy.
But it was a state in name only. Mussolini had no real power. He was completely dependent on the German military.
So as the Allies finally broke through the Gothic line in April of 1945, his puppet state just collapsed.
Mussolini tried one last desperate escape. He disguised himself as a German soldier in a military convoy, trying to flee to Switzerland.
But he was recognized near Lake Como and captured by Italian partisans.
And that was the definitive end of fascism in Italy. He was executed by the partisans on April 28, 1945.
And to make sure everyone knew the dictator was dead and that the movement wouldn't be resurrected, his body was publicly displayed in a square in Milan. A brutal, but in their view, necessary end.
Just days later, the German commanders in Italy, realizing the war was completely lost, surrendered. The official surrender came on May 10, 1945, just days before Germany's final surrender.
So when you look back at the whole campaign, the cost was just staggering. It was one of the longest, most difficult operations for the Allies. Over 300,000 Allied casualties. Killed, wounded, or missing.
But strategically, it did achieve its goals. By forcing Germany to keep 24 divisions tied down in Italy, it pulled vital troops and resources away from other fronts.
Troops Hitler desperately needed to fight the D-Day invasion and the final push into Germany.
It also restored democracy to Italy, and I think it proved the effectiveness of multinational cooperation. You had soldiers from dozens of countries all fighting together.
And they learned some crucial, very painful lessons about mountain warfare that would influence military strategy for years.
So the Italian campaign, it was supposed to be that soft underbelly, a quick shortcut.
And instead it became this brutal, years-long war that showed how geography can completely defeat even the most ambitious military plans. It succeeded, but the price was astronomical.
And that price raises a final interesting question for you to think about. If the Allied High Command had known back in 1943 just how difficult the Italian terrain would be, would they still have committed so many resources to a campaign that was pretty much guaranteed to be overshadowed by the bigger invasion of France?
Something to think about as you study the logistics of World War II.
Good luck with your studies.